Okay, good morning, everyone. This lecture is for, let's see, what is today? Today's September 18th, 2024. So this lecture is for English 252 online course, English Composition, Introduction to Composition. As you know, I'm your professor, Jeremy Jackson. So today I want to do a couple things. I wanted to, at the end, towards the end, we're going to go over when you're your personal essay rough draft is due via Blackboard. I'll give you instructions on that. And I'm going to send you an email on that morning. It's due this Friday, September 20th. But I'll send you an email that morning. You're having until midnight to upload it to Blackboard. I'll give you detailed instructions on how to upload that rough draft. And it could be just that. It could be in a rough state. Also, the second thing I want to do, and you can see it here, I wanted to go over a really good personal essay by a professional essayist, Brent Staples. He wrote this essay. Let's see. I'm going to read this in a moment. But just back in 1986, for Miss Magazine. I'm not even sure that magazine is around anymore, even in an online iteration of it. But within the essay, he is using a lot of the techniques and elements of writing that I think we should try to infuse in our own essay. If you remember, we looked at that essay by a student from a prior semester. Really good essay. I put it on, as I said before, on the A+ level, where she talks about going camping with her then boyfriend, right? And how they went through trials and tribulations, tragedy and triumph, while they're camping, and they got stuck on the shoreline after the ocean current came in, and they were finally saved. But she learned a lot from it. She infused dialogue. If you remember, within the essay, within her personal testimony of something that happened to her in the past, and that's exactly what these essays are about. You don't need to reference any outside material for this essay. You will in your essays later on in the semester. But for this essay, it's just you talking about a past situation that happened to you, right? But she infused dialogue in that essay, the camping essay. She infused internal dialogue, like her internal thoughts. Remember, she italicized those to show the internal dialogue. So Brent Staples is able to infuse some of those elements. You're going to see some dialogue, some internal dialogue. You're going to see some imagery. And when we say imagery, he's just infusing ideas of images so we can see what's going on. He's going to show us what's happening in this past story. Images, right? Think of imagery, we think of images, and often they're built through simile and metaphor. So comparing something to something else is what he's going to do here, and what we should try to infuse in our own essay. It doesn't have to be every other line, doesn't have to be that, but it's interesting to use creative writing techniques to make our stories compelling. He uses dark language, violent language, to paint a really vivid picture of what had happened to him in his past, of being targeted as a black man in public space, as we're going to see in a moment. Okay, so I'm just going to read from this, see what we can take away. This essay is often taught as a personal essay because of the imagery, as I just mentioned, his use of creative writing techniques, but also symbolism, as we're going to see when we get to the very bottom of the essay. So I'm going to go ahead and read it aloud, attempt to follow along. I'll also attach it to this email, the physical copy, so you can read it at your leisure if you wish. So here we go. Brent Staples, Black Man in Public Space. This right here should be quotation marked as well, double quotation at the very beginning of this title, because it is an essay. Right. So Brent Staples, born 1951, earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago, and went on to become a journalist. The following essay originally appeared in Miss Magazine, as we already talked about, in 1986, under the title Just Walk On By, which is interesting why he changed it. So think about that as we read this. Staples revised it slightly for publication in Harper's a year later, so in 1987, under the present title, Black Man in Public Space. The particular occasion for Staples' reflection is an incident that occurred for the first time in the mid-1970s when he was discovered that his mere presence on the street late at night was enough to frighten a young white woman. Recalling this incident leads him to reflect on issues of race, gender, and class in the United States. When we say United States, let's think about just Western culture. This can extend out just past the United States to North America in general, right? I'm sure this takes place in Canada, where there's biases that are wielded against people of color, in terms of race or gender and class in Canada. But I would say with greater frequency, it does take place in the United States with this storied history. As you read this essay, just reading directly from this document, think about why Staples chose the new title, Black Men in Public Space, instead of Just Walk On By. Think about that, or sort of reflect on that. I have a number of things I want to point out about this essay as we go, but most likely I'm going to sum it up completely when we get to the end. So I'm just going to read from this essay by Brent Staples, Black Men in Public Space. My first victim was a woman, white, well-dressed, probably in her early 20s. I came upon her late one evening on a deserted street in Hyde Park, a relatively affluent neighborhood in an otherwise mean, impoverished section of Chicago. As I swung to the avenue behind her, there seemed to be a discreet, uninflammatory distance between us. Not so. She cast back a worried glance. To her, the youngish black man, a broad 6 feet 2 inches with a beard and billowing hair, both hands shoved into the pockets of a bulky military jacket, seemed menacingly close. After a few more quick glimpses, she picked up her pace and was soon running in earnest. Within seconds, she disappeared into a cross street. That was more than a decade ago. I was 22 years old, a graduate student newly arrived at the University of Chicago. It was in the echo of that terrified woman's footfalls that I first began to know the unwieldy inheritance I'd come into, the ability to alter public space in ugly ways. It was clear that she thought herself the query of a mugger, a rapist, or worse. Suffering about an insomnia, however, I was stalking sleep, not defenseless wayfarers. As a softy who was scarcely able to take a knife to a raw chicken, let alone hold on to a person's throat, I was surprised, embarrassed, and dismayed all at once. Her flight made me feel like an accomplice in tyranny. It also made it clear that I was indistinguishable from the muggers who occasionally seeped into the area from the surrounding ghetto. That first encounter and those that followed signified that a vast, unnerving gulf lay between nighttime pedestrians, particularly women, and me. And I soon gathered that being perceived as dangerous is a hazard in itself. I only needed to turn a corner into a dicey situation, or crowd some frightened armed person in a foyer somewhere, or make an errant move after being pulled over by a policeman. Where fear and weapons meet, and they often do in urban America, there is always the possibility of death. In that first year, my first away from my hometown, I was to become thoroughly familiar with the language of fear. At dark, shadowy intersections, I could cross in front of a car stopped at a traffic light and elicit the thunk, thunk, thunk of the driver, black, white, male, or female, hammering down the door locks. On less traveled streets after dark, I grew accustomed to, but never comfortable with, people crossing to the other side of the street rather than past me. Then there were the standard unpleasantries with policemen, doormen, bouncers, cab drivers, and others whose business it is to screen out troublesome individuals before there was any nastiness. I moved to New York nearly 2 years ago, and I've remained an avid night walker. In central Manhattan, the near constant crowd cover minimizes tense one-on-one street encounters. Elsewhere in Soho, for example, where sidewalks are narrow and tightly spaced buildings shut out the sky, things can get very taut indeed. After dark, on the Warren-like streets of Brooklyn where I live, I often see women who fear the worst from me. They seem to have set their faces on neutral, and with their purse straps strung across their chest, bandolier style, they forge ahead as though bracing themselves against being tackled. I understand, of course, that the danger they perceive is not a hallucination. Women are particularly vulnerable to street violence, and young black males are drastically overrepresented among the perpetrators of that violence. Yet these truths are no solace against the kind of alienation that comes of being ever the suspect, a fearsome entity with whom pedestrians avoid making contact with. It is not altogether clear to me how I reached the ripe old age of 22 without being conscious of the lethality nighttime pedestrians attributed to me. Perhaps it was because in the Chester, Pennsylvania, the small, angry industrial town where I came of age in the 1960s, I was scarcely noticeable against the backdrop of gang warfare, street knifings, and murders. I grew up one of the good boys, had perhaps a half dozen fistfights. In retrospect, my shyness of combat has clear sources. As a boy, I saw countless tough guys locked away. I have since buried several too. They were babies, really. A teenage cousin, a brother of 22, a childhood friend in his mid-20s, all gone in episodes of bravado played out in the streets. I came to doubt the virtues of intimidation early on. I chose, perhaps unconsciously, to remain a shadow, timid, but a survivor. The fearsome mistakenly attributed me in public places often has a perilous flavor. The most frightening of these confusions occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s when I worked as a journalist in Chicago. One day, rushing to the office of a magazine I was writing for with a deadline story in hand, I was mistaken for a burglar. The office manager called security and, with an ad hoc posse, pursued me through the Lambeth halls, nearly to my editor's door. I had no way of proving who I was. I could only move briskly towards the company of someone who knew me. Another time was on assignment for a local paper and killing time before an interview. I entered a jewelry store on the city's affluent near North Side. The proprietor excused herself and returned with an enormous red Doberman pinscher straining at the end of a leash. She stood, the dog extended toward me, silent to my questions, her eyes bulging nearly out of her head. I took a cursory look around, nodded, and bade her goodnight. Relatively speaking, however, I never faced as badly as another black male journalist. He went to a nearby Waukegan, Illinois, a couple of summers ago to work on a story about a murderer who was born there. Mistaking the reporter for the killer, police officers hauled him from his car at gunpoint, and but for his press credentials, would probably have tried to book him. Such episodes are not uncommon. Black men trade tales like this all the time. Over the years, I learned to smother the rage I felt so often being taken for a criminal. Not to do so would surely have led to madness. I now take precautions to make myself less threatening. I move about with care, particularly late in the evening. I give a wide berth to nervous people on subway platforms during the wee hours, particularly when I have exchanged business clothes for jeans. If I happen to be entering a building behind some people who appear skittish, I may walk by, letting them clear the lobby before I return, so as to not seem to be following them. I have been calm and extremely congenial on those rare occasions when I've been pulled over by the police. And on late evening constitutionals, I employ what has proven to be an excellent tension-reducing measure. I whistle melodies from Beethoven and Vivaldi and the popular classical composers. Even steely New Yorkers, hunching toward nighttime destinations, seem to relax and occasionally even join in the tune. Virtually everybody seems to sense that a mugger wouldn't be warbling bright, sunny selections from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. It is my equivalent of the cowbell that hikers wear when they know they're in bear country. Wow, powerful. Okay, so he ends the essay after giving us a whole lot of imagery, a whole lot of powerful verbs. Remember, we talked about the idea of torquing verbs, using a verb, and then choosing a more, I guess, precise verb that is more dynamic, that gives us more action. All right, he's able to employ that masterfully. This is really a master class on personal essay writing. Brett Staples' essay, Black Men in Public Space. He infuses a lot, not only powerful verbs, he infuses a lot of dark imagery, a dark, what we might consider or label a dark motif. He uses evening a few times, I think to the tune of 3. He says evening, which is, we attribute evening as darkness, right? He uses the word night, N-I-G-H-T, 5 times. So he's sprinkling throughout the essay this dark imagery in order to reflect the dark motif of being this black man, one, right? Just being black, being the color black, right? Interfacing with white people in this world and seeming as if he's violent. So the darkness of violence also seeps out through this idea of using the word night. He uses the very word black 4 times, right? So he's sprinkling that dark motif. Uses shadow twice. The word shadow uses dark 3 times. So evening, night, black, shadow, dark, late. The word late he uses 3 times. He's using this very prescribed, very particular, specific language. And we wouldn't even notice it if we didn't go through and actually pick it out, right? He uses it so masterfully that we walk away with the unconscious, not even conscious of this. We're not even aware of this until it's pointed out by me, necessarily. Maybe you caught it. I didn't the first time I read this essay in graduate school. But we walk away feeling that dark motif, feeling, wow, this is heavy. Not only do we understand the story of Brent Staples through his trials and tribulations of growing up, right, in a hard, scrambled neighborhood in Pennsylvania he talks about. He's on that journey. But also just being a black man that is being biased in society, being racially pointed out, right, racially profiled in society, and how that's problematic. And he tries to dissuade and disarm people, as we see in the end of the essay. He came up with a ploy, a technique that he uses in order to disarm those women, particularly white women he talks about early on. So that's how we get to sort of that other side of race, right? We get the black him being black, African American, that side of race, but also what people are perceiving of him. That's where it gets kind of complex, right? We might want to think about how we infuse that type of emotion of how people perceive us within our own essay when you start to write, if you haven't already, your personal essay. How are the characters within your essay, if you have any, perceiving you, right? Because in story, we only understand the protagonist, and then your own story, you are the protagonist, right? We only understand the protagonist through a number of different ways. One, how people treat that protagonist. So think about how you're being treated in your own story. How is Brent Staples being treated in his own story, right? He's being biased. He's being treated as lesser than, as a second citizen in his own story by white people, right? Diametrically opposed to this otherly person who was white people. So we know that about characters in their stories. So we know that too about your own character in your own story as the protagonist. How are people treating you? How are they talking about you? Their dialogue reflects who you are as a person, right? And where the tension comes from within your story. The tension within this story for Brent Staples is being racially profiled, right? That's the conflict of his story. How he's able to overcome that is also how he fixes that conflict, right? Within the short personal essay that from a student who went camping, if you recall, right, with her boyfriend, right? The conflict was her relationship with her boyfriend. It was complicated, but also it achieved the highest level of conflict, what we call the apogee or the zenith of conflict, right? When they got stuck on that island, when the tide came in, right? And then it was being diffused and was fixed, and she eventually realized this was not the guy she wanted to end up with. She said some moment or an epiphany that we're going to sort of maybe try to infuse in our own essay towards its end. Right, so for Brent Staples, his epiphany is like, I got to act different. I got to change my personhood, who I am, my selfhood in society in order to change and disarm them of how they perceive me. All right, so we looked at the dark motif, evening, night, black, shadow, dark, late, all very intentional and methodical on Brent Staples' part in order to paint this beautiful mosaic of complication and dark motif of him being racially profiled and racial stereotypes being wielded. And if you remember, 1980s, well, just by looking in history, the long arm of history, 1986, was probably second or third wave of civil rights movement in the United States, particularly in the United States. You remember the 1960s, the late 50s and early 60s was the burgeoning area, the genesis of Martin Luther King Jr. Advocating on behalf of black people in the United States in order to create change of goodness, to seek civil equality within the United States, right? Then we had maybe a second move in the 70s and the third move in the 1980s. So Brent Staples is at the tip of the spear of that third wave movement to seek civil rights equality in the United States. And that essay, his essay is exemplary of that. He doesn't come out, hit us over the head and say, hey, within this essay, right? He doesn't have a thesis statement, just like we're not going to have a thesis statement within our own personal essay. We're never going to say to the reader or to me when I read it, within this personal essay, I'm going to talk about the time that I went camping and got stuck on an island, or I'm going to talk about the time where I was racially profiled, and this is how I overcame it by warbling classical music by Vivaldi's Four Seasons, right? Brent Staples doesn't come out and tell us what this essay is going to be about. He shows us. He takes us throughout a history lesson, and it's pretty linear. He starts in the very back and moves his way forward, right? Of where places he's been, where he grew up, right? Just like we saw within the personal essay by the prior student when they went camping. She just took us to a place in history and brought us forward in a linear fashion, like a movie unfolding. Let's see. Dark motif, great. Civil rights. He uses some language that lends itself to violence. He uses the word cross, right? If you think about something being crossed with someone, he uses that 4 times, right? That lends itself to the idea of violence. Intersection, talks about the intersection, right? So there's a physical intersection with driving. I think that's what he's referencing on one level, right? But on a second level, he's referencing the metaphorical intersection, right? Of two people coming together, and the intersectionality of that, right? The conflict that exists between white women, white people, and black people in the United States at this time, right? The intersection of those two things, which I think is brilliant. I'm just going to go through the essay. He gives us a hook at the very beginning. This is great. The first victim was a woman, white, well-dressed, probably in her early 20s. Wow. Right? I'm wanting to read on. I want to figure out what is going on with this victim of his. Right? Did he rape her? Is he a rapist? Right? Did he attack her? Did the woman attack him? What's going on here? Right? I superimpose everything that's in our current, what we call our current milieu, which is just another fancy word for era, in our current racial era, right? Which is there's a lot of police overreach, and it's a lot of inequality in terms of brutality wielded against minorities in the United States, right? So I'm superimposing that over this when I look at it. Is this guy the benefactor in a way of racial profiling, which we come to find out he is? How does he sort of traverse the landscape of this and avoid it, right? Which we come to find out later on. All right, he gets an education, so it has a lot to do with that, achieving a higher education than the people around him. He gets a PhD, but also he adapts his personality to that. Okay, so violent imagery, we see that with the victim here, the word victim. Later on, he mentions black. I swung to the avenue, so swinging is a violent act. Uses the word terrified. He engages us not only through imagery, right, but he uses actual sound, right? He sonically engages us. Uses the word footfalls, right? That's sort of, we hear that footfall, right? It was in the echo. I'm quoting here. It was in the echo. This is the second paragraph. Begin the second paragraph. It was in the echo of that terrified woman's footfalls that I first began to know the unwieldy inheritance I'd come into, the ability to alter public spaces in ugly ways. Wow, using the word ugly, right? Ugly ways. How he alters this space that would otherwise be neutral, right? But he's altering in an ugly way because how he's being perceived by society. How is he, as protagonist, being seen by the antagonist of this story, right? It's the question that comes up. And he's being perceived, he's telling us, I'm being perceived as an ugly person, right? The query of a mugger, a rapist, or worse, right, is how it's being perceived. He's engaging us with that sonic engagement of footfalls. Later on, he does the locking sound, the thunk, 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 thunk of the locking of the doors, right, of these people when he's walking down the street, right? So we understand how the people are treating him, right? They're racially profiling him. They're going to lock the doors because they're afraid. Just by looking at him on the surface who he is, right? Judging the book by its cover, not looking deeper into the complexity of who he is as a human being, right? They can't tell his educational level by looking at him necessarily, right? Especially when he, as he says, exchanged jeans and a button-up shirt, for his regular business attire, right? But he has to develop that technique. He has to do what's called code switching. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea, but we all do it, right? We code switch, right? So I might act different to you than I do in front of my friends, right? I might use a higher register of academic talking with you, and then with my friends, perhaps I'm more conversational. That's code switching. And he does that. He code switches by adopting that classical music whistling and humming, right? That cowbell. That when he uses that, he's in bear country, which is an amazing. It's what we talk about in creative writing is symbolism. That cowbell, right? It symbolizes something. It's a warning system to these people around him. Hey, I'm not the enemy. You don't have to racially profile me. I'm a good dude. I'm not one of the bad guys that became a rapist or a murderer or worse, right? I'm a regular guy. In fact, I'm better than a regular guy. I'm educated, right? So I'm going to sing and whistle classical music, right, to you to show you. Right, that's my cowbell to warn you that I know I'm in bear country and you're the bear. Right, that's also symbolic. Right, you're the bear and I'm in bear country, and therefore I'm going to have this bell to warn you so I don't startle you in the middle of the road. Very sophisticated way to craft this essay and to infuse meaning within it. Okay, what else is he doing? He uses some very particular language here, which I think it cuts to the quick, to the crux of this essay, of its meaning. Let's see. Right here. I first began to know the unwieldy inheritance I come into, the ability to alter public space in ugly ways. So that unwieldy inheritance, that's interesting language. Right? He inherited this idea from a society that is considering him to be this person that perpetuates violence as a black person. Right? His parents would have been labeled as black people, therefore been labeled as a second citizen, therefore not treated as equal in white society, right? So that inheritance, and hopefully we begin to think that maybe Brent Staples is stopping that inheritance so that his children or his offspring or people that he exposes himself to later in life don't have that unwieldy inheritance of ugliness. That society is superimposing on him and overlaying on him. It's not him saying, doing anything of action that would show that he was ugly or unequal to white people, right? But we get that sense that society writ large is treating him like this. All right, I'm just looking on the second page. He continues with the dark language, and violent language, war-like streets, Fear, he uses forge, bracing, vulnerable, violence, black, perpetrator rather, alienation, violence, suspect, fearsome. I'm just reading directly from this essay. Lethality, nighttime, angry, warfare, knifings, murders, combat, shadow, intimidation, perilous, frightening, deadline. Uses that word deadline for a story, but he's very prescribed and methodical, Staples is, in using that word deadline to infuse it with the idea of death, right? Deadline, story in hand. I was mistaken for a burglar, so that violence of being burglarized. Next paragraph, he uses the word killing, straining, bulging, badly, black, killer, murder, halt, criminal, black, rage, madness. Again, these are direct quotes from this essay. Very last page, 2 paragraphs. I'll just scroll to it. Uses the word evening, nervous, skittish, nighttime. And he ends with the idea of him, of course, warbling, him whistling these bright, sunny selections from Vivaldi's Seasons. And he has this end effect. In creative writing, we call it a coda, right? That could be in a short story. We use an end effect that leaves the reader with this feeling that they have to question what that means, right? We see that in poetry often, a coda, C-O-D-A, a coda. It's the end effect, the end of anything, the end of a novel, right? The novel has a little more space to create a coda. It could be the last chapter that really leaves us with the end effect. Within an essay, right, it's at the very end. And we see it here with Staples. It is my equivalent of the cowbell that hikers wear when they know they're in bear country. So we have to ask ourselves, what is this cowbell that hikers wear? Well, we know that if you ever hiked, I know I have with my wife, in Jasper and Banff, definitely Jasper, in Algonquin in Ontario too. There's bears. There's grizzlies in Jasper, as we know, right? So we wear, for our backpacks, we have a bear belt, right? What Staples is calling a cowbell here. He's kind of mixing metaphors, cowbell and bear country. But we know what he means. He's wearing a warning system to the bears around him so that he doesn't turn a corner in the woods, in this case, the city, Manhattan, in New York City, and just frighten someone by his mere presence, what he looks like in society, how society perceives him, right? Is this black man? And being racially profiled as this violent individual, despite the fact that he's not, which is why he adopts this and adapts his personality. He adopts this idea and adapts his personality he code switches in order to quell their fears. So let me just go through my notes here. His intended audience. Who is his intended audience? You might think about that with our own writing. Who is the audience? You're not just writing to me necessarily. You're writing to yourself. You're really trying to give good, solid fidelity to what happened to you in the past, right? Obviously, memory is imperfect. I tell people, my students, memory is imperfect. Therefore, some of your dialogue, you might have to make up a bit and tweak it a bit. Some of what happened to you, Brent Staples doesn't remember every detail necessarily when he sat down in 1986 to craft this essay of what happened to him years prior. So he might have had to fill in the holes by making it up a bit. So just think about that. Think about who your audience is. He's not. So his audience is more academic, I would say, because he's being more academic in his writing. Right? He's not just being conversational. Hey man, you know what happened to me years ago when I was a black man growing up and whatever. Right? That's more conversational. He's not doing that. He's writing academically here, right? He's aware of his audience being more educated. So one of the questions I ask, and it's important, I think, is why he changed the title with his essay. He changed it from Just Walk On By, right here, to Black Men in Public Space, right here. Could be for a number of reasons. I think Black Men in Public Space is more precise, right? He's actually showing he's given us a glimpse, and your title of your essay should be the same. It should give us a glimpse into what the essay is going to be about. It shouldn't just be thrown on the page, right? It has nothing to do with what the actual content of the essay is. It should be methodical on your part, right? And certainly Brent Staples is doing that. He's saying this essay is going to be about black men in public space. Damn it. Pay attention, because that's what it's going to be about, right? It's not going to be about necessarily this more generalized title, Just Walk On By, right? Whatever that means. Can mean a number of different things, like leave me alone in society, just walk on by, I'm not violent. I'm sure it means something like that. Could have a number of threads in terms of what it means. Think about his dark imagery that I infuse in order to create that sensation or feeling or emotion of darkness and bleakness and despair, right? How you can infuse that same sort of imagery and motif within your own writing. It could be the opposite. It doesn't have to be dark. It could be light and some levity and comedy that you bring to your essay. We already talked about the meaning of unwieldy inheritance that he's inherited from his parents, inherited by society, of how they perceive the inequality of black men. especially what they perceive as violence in black men when they're in public space, right? When they're in city and urban dwellings, urban environs. And then, of course, we talked about the symbolism of cowbell. And he's able to tackle a number of heavy topics that you might think about within your own essay writing, right? In his, it was race, gender, and class in the United States, right? How those things treated. Okay, great essay, amazing essay. When I first read it years ago, I was like, man, this is amazing. One day I'm going to become a professor and I'm going to teach people this essay and how much in just 3 pages. It's single space. Ours is going to be double spaced, right? But his is single space. In 3 pages, he's able to cram a whole lot of material in it to really compel us, to really communicate to us what had happened to him in his past, how he was racially profiled. And infuse it with a lot of imagery, right? Take us on this journey, right? In his own story. You might want to think about how you can do the same within your own essay. Okay, so our essay rough draft is due this Friday, by midnight on Friday. I'm going to email you Friday morning saying, hey, here are the instructions for uploading your rough draft to Blackboard by midnight tonight on September 20th. Today's September 18th, so you got a couple days to sit down and, finish crafting your rough draft. Email me if you have any questions, of course. So it's going to be your final draft. Your rough draft, I would say at a minimum, be 3 pages long, double spaced, right? Which shouldn't be that hard. People often go over, which is fine. But your final draft is going to be 3 to 5 pages long, double spaced. All right, it's going to be using MLA formatting style. Your MLA formatting style, like how your spacing is, where your name is, where my name is, where the class and the date is on the essay is not important for the rough draft, but it will be important when you turn in the final draft, all right? Okay, so on Friday, after midnight closes out, that window closes out for you to upload your essay. So on Saturday, you will not be able to upload your essay. On the 21st of September, the window will be closed, and you will not be able to upload your essay. So upload it by then, that rough draft, right? Because I'm going to go in, I'm going to make comments on your rough draft. And on Saturday morning, right, you're going to be assigned, you don't have to do it on Saturday, but I'm just saying on Saturday, you'll be assigned 3 random essays by students within this class. So if you're self-conscious of your story and you don't want people to know that it's you, even though we're online, don't include your name in your essay. And it should be anonymous anyway. I set it up so it's anonymous. Let me know if that's an issue. So you're going to be sent 3 essays. I'm going to give you till the end of next week to go in. I think it's the end of next week. I have to look at the course outline. I'll let you know on Friday. To go in and comment on those 3 random essays that you're going to be assigned by your fellow peers in this class. And all you have to do is give 1 or 2 sentences of substantive feedback. You don't want to say, oh, it was really good. I really like that. No, just give some feedback. You infuse imagery. You really had a strong story. I felt as if your dialogue was well done. It was really exemplary about what I feel the emotion of the moment was in your dialogue. Right? Things like that. And I'll give you the same sort of feedback on your essay. So please reach out to me if you have any questions. If not, I'll communicate to you on Friday. We're going to look at another essay called I Want a Wife, which is a personal essay written around the same time. I think it's the same magazine, in fact, Miss Magazine. So we're going to look at that. I'm going to read it aloud. We're going to talk about how she's able to really build this beautiful story and able to infuse it with the same level of imagery and meaning and dialogue, right?